Let's get started on our last presentation here. We're going to be hearing from Chris Yeomans. Chris Yeomans is a professor of philosophy at Purdue University. He's written on a variety of topics in Hegel, including books on his theory of free will and his social moral psychology. He's currently finishing a book on classical German political philosophy in its social historical context. His paper for us today is entitled Synchronic and Diachronic Aspects of Historicity in Hegel's State. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks everybody for staying until late on a Sunday afternoon, and thanks to Dean and Sebastian and Kate and Nick for organizing this and running this. Really appreciate it. Would love to be with everybody in person, but really glad that we could be here in honor of Terry. I'll tell one Terry Pinkard story, which is, I don't know if you remember this, Terry, but in 2016, after the author meets critics session on Jim Crinus's book at the Central APA, we went, a bunch of us went over to that Vapiano's across from the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. And it was a bunch of mid-career people. I know Jim was there, Clinton was there, Brady Bowman was there, Dean, I think you were there too. And I was standing with Terry and I just asked Terry, how many of these people's books have you refereed? How many tenure letters have you written for people? And Terry just sort of shrugged with some humility. But I think I said to you, Terry, something like, I mean, this is like this garden that you've nurtured here. And as I've gotten to the point in my career where I write lots of those letters and referee lots of those book manuscripts, I'm very aware of how much time and effort and energy and patience that takes. And so I know there's a bunch of us here who owe Terry a great debt, a moral debt, that unfortunately we cannot quite repay for that kind of work. So thanks very much, Terry, for that. Maybe in my own way of repaying it, I will try and leave us not with option number one. I want to see what's behind door number 3, which I take to be reform. I'm going to offer you far less than a view about how to reform contemporary American politics, but some things that I find valuable in Hegel for thinking about this. And so let me see, I just had this shared. And all right, here we go. Everybody see the slides? Yep, okay, good. So let me just say, I'm going to talk about synchronic and diachronic aspects of historicity. These terms obviously come from linguistics. And maybe it's an interesting question we can take up in Q&A. I hadn't really thought about it before this conference, whether language is an institution in Hegel's sense or not. I don't mean these in any particular linguistic sense. I simply mean synchronic to describe sort of time slice views or views of things at a time, and diachronic to describe change over time or the way things are changing over time. And what I've gotten really interested in and what I've thought of as the level of Hegel's analysis that we can make use of for the contemporary moment has to do with this kind of interplay of the synchronic and diachronic aspects, because I suppose we all have our own Trump derangement syndromes. But what sort of struck me in 2016 was this felt sort of slapped and thought, wait a minute, we're still in history, right? The past is still with us in this way. And I'd forgotten this, as it were. So this is my therapy, as it were, which I share with you. So it's connected with this move that Terry makes in the book on the history lectures. That's connected with the last thing that Lydia left us with about how to deal with Hegel's comments on non-European societies, which I found just really useful. And so here's what Terry says. In the last analysis, Hegel's rather negative characterization of non-European shapes of life turns out to be less about them, despite what Hegel himself actually thought it was about, and more about the problems inherent in any collective enterprise that either takes something to be like the moral to be equivalent to actually existing social rules, or which takes its own collective project to be simply unintelligible and less available and thus available only to the mystical. Sorry, typo. Even though that may be a fundamental mischaracterization of non-European shapes of life, Hegel discusses both options were live in Hegel's time for European life itself. So what I find interesting about this is this, this move to use the contrasts that Hegel draws, not as telling us anything about non-European societies. I completely accept, Mark Alsnauer's point that in the post-Marxist, post-Weberian mood or expectations that we have, we're not going to get any kind of historiography out of Hegel that's going to satisfy us in any way at all. But to use the terms that were in Terry, the quote from Terry that Robert Pippin began with, we're nonetheless agents who are constrained by our past, absorbed in our present, and oriented to our future. And I'm curious, or I'm interested in finding out in Hegel how he thought about the historicity of Europe. And one way of doing that is to draw the contrast, or to see how he drew the contrast. Okay. It's related to a classic claim that Hegel makes in the lectures on the philosophy of world history about the nature of history and what differentiates history from nature, and that is conflict, right? And conflict, I take it, between sort of full-blooded but alienated normative visions, or visions about what matters in life, right? So he says in this, you all know this, spirit wants to attain to its own concept, but it conceals itself from it and is proud and full of satisfaction in its alienation from itself. Spiritual development, therefore, is not just a harmless and conflict-free process of emergence as in organic life, but rather a hard and obstinate labor directed to itself. Moreover, it involves not merely the formal aspect of developing as such, but rather the production of a purpose or end with the spirit, with a specific content. We have established from the beginning what this end is. It is spirit, indeed spirit, according with some concept of freedom, right? These are the driving principles of development. And what I want to insist on here is going to come out in everything that follows and comes out in the paper is, number one, he's talking about substantive versus formal conflict. And this is something we can learn a little bit about by tracing the distinction he makes between Persian and Greek history on the one hand, which he thinks does have substantive conflict, and Chinese and Indian history on the other, which he thinks only has formal conflict. The other thing that admittedly is not quite said here, but I think is right, and also came out in Jay Bernstein's paper, is what we're really talking about here is conflict between multiple alienated forms of consciousness. That is, we're talking about conflicts between perspectives, each of which see something and get something right and are blind to something. That's Antigone and Creon, right? That's going to be the civil society and corporate society and so on. And that the fullness of the vision and thus the fullness of the clash is really important. Okay, so in the paper, I try and basically work in two directions. Is number one, to try and show what's diachronic, what's developmental, even if it's sort of frozen in a way in the philosophy of right, which is really just presenting you, here's this institution, and it's an essentially synchronic presentation. And then I want to flip around and do the other thing, which is to show the synchronic nature of the development in the philosophy of history. And again, I'm not going to try and deal with the big history story here, but try and zero in on, or focus in on the nature of the conflicts that are involved in the contrasts that Hegel draws. Okay, so in talking about the diachronic or sort of developmental nature, the way there's a kind of frozen development in the philosophy of right, I pick up on two different features, one in Kant and one in Fichte. The bit in Kant, we actually had a talk about already from Lydia Gurr about provisionality. And so this is the way Kant presents the notion of provisionality. He says, and for Kant, essentially private law as such, that is the law of property, contract, and this weird thingly right to persons, right? In the absence of public law is all just provisional, right? In the absence of the omnilateral will. So it's something essential about private law being provisional, I think, for Kant. So Kant says, possession and anticipation and preparation for the civil condition, which can be based only on a law of common will, possession which therefore accords with the possibility of such condition is provisionally rightful possession, whereas possession found in an actual civil condition would be conclusive possession, right? The way I think this is normally read is that there's a kind of threshold that at some point we're going to cross and we're going to get into that actual civil condition. I'm convinced by the history of the time, by arguments made by people like J.P. Messina and Elizabeth Ellis, that Kant's view, that can't be Kant's view, right? That instead the civil condition, as Lydia Gore was saying, remains a kind of regulative ideal. And that essentially we're always in this provisional stage trying to understand rights claims that are valid but not conclusively valid. And just to really wave my hands, in Hegel, I've come to think that this is how we ought to understand the relation between the sets of economic terms that we get in the discussion of abstract right and the set of economic terms that we get in the discussion of civil society. So in abstract right, we get a discussion of property or Eigentum and contract or Vertrag, and I think that's essentially replaced or by a notion of resources or Vermögen on the one hand and corporations on the other. So I think we should see in Hegel's philosophy of right this kind of provisional conclusive relationship. But what Hegel's building into the conclusive side of it is essentially a kind of sociology of the kinds of conflicts that we would have about our provisional rights claims. Okay, so much for Kant. I then talk briefly about Fichte, and what I just find absolutely fascinating about Fichte is trying to fit together the foundations, the closed commercial state, and the addresses to the German nation, which are all, in a certain sense, nominally about the same thing. They're about political right in Germany, and they take such dramatically different approaches to things. And so in the paper, this is the point where I bring in Reinhard Koselleck and his view, and I really think that the foundations of natural right, they give you a kind of a priori theory that's really about the future. It's really about what Koselleck calls the horizon of expectations. It's this kind of situations that's necessary, that's possible because it's necessary in a way. This is the only way that human beings could relate to each other and be just, right? And then you get the closed commercial state, which is this fascinating exercise in freezing everything, essentially in the present, and encapsulating everything. And it's just like German hometown writ large with guilds and all, right? And then the addresses give you this scheme of political action. It's this educational scheme. For those of you who haven't read it in a while, it's Pestalozzi. He thinks we're going to have these essentially, we would now call them re-education camps, where we're going to drag people out of their families, put them in the right kind of situation, and then that'll be what we would now call the vanguard that will lead society on. So look, the vast majority of this Hegel's got no truck with at all. But there is something in the background here that I think is really important for Hegel that comes out in this split in Fichte, and is something that both the Cambridge School of the Historiography of Political Philosophy, and particularly in Skinner's discussion of the state, and also in the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe School of Historiography in Germany, play a really important role. And that's this notion that what's happening socially in modernity is that this sort of integral package of feudal social life is breaking apart in three directions. Into civil society in the one direction that is differentiating itself from an older corporate society, what in Germany we would call a Ständegesellschaft, and that those two forms of society are being distinguished from the state, right? So you have this sort of field of tension in the historical present, right, that's formed by these things pulling us apart. And I want to read Fichte as registering that, and then Hegel as building it into the state, into, first of all, these different Stände, the business estate, the Gewerbe, the Standesgewerbes, which has this accelerationist orientation to the future, towards the horizon of expectation, this substantial or agricultural estate that has this inertial tie to the past, right, to the space of experience and the conditions that were transmitted on. And then, of course, Hegel's universal estate, the bureaucrats, the civil servants, the professors, the doctors, who are, the people with the proverbial 5-year plans, right, trying to maintain things in the present. To tie this back to some conversations that we had with Jean-Francois Kervegan, this is in a way, I think, my version of a strong institutionalist Hegel, right? Where I really do think Hegel thinks these are the 3 basic perspectives we can take up. And your conscience, your individual conscience, could be modified by and modify each of these. But history sort of packages these together. All right, well, I don't want to, let's go ahead and move on. There's lots of stuff to talk about. Right, so now to go the other way, right? The second direction, to try and find the synchronic and the diachronic, and to talk about the kinds of conflict that Hegel thinks are characteristic of Persia and Greece as opposed to China and India. I won't read this, but essentially this is this point. It's one of the many points. I think it's worth noting in the history lectures. Hegel all the time will say, when he gets to a certain stage, and now we're really in history. And then you get to the next stage, and actually now we're really in history, and so on. And I take all of these to be essentially relative. And the important point is just to see what the conflicts are. But the thing that I want to pull out of this, because I think it's really important for Hegel, is Hegel thinks China and India didn't fail to master some problem and therefore collapse. They actually mastered their problem. And that's why they're still here. And that's why, in a certain way, there's still live options for us, right? I think Hegel thinks that the kinds of conflicts that the Chinese and Indian world presented, which are essentially conflicts that are construed in natural terms, are essentially indefinitely manageable. But it's the kind of conflicts that Persia and Greece and then Germany present that are maybe unmanageable. Right? Because they're not natural conflicts. They are conflicts between different versions of fully normative claims. So this, he does say about Persia, right? What he wants to emphasize about Persia is it was an empire of nations in a way, right? Of groups with their own fully formed views about what mattered in life, right? And its genius was to be able to combine those, he thinks, until in the end Islam becomes intolerant of the others, right? That's the sort of decline of the Persian Empire, right? But Persia is not available for us, and Hegel thinks that's part of why we don't even have good records about what's going on in Persia, right? Okay. Let's see, I think I will skip this about China for the sake of time, but the point that I make in the paper is essentially, the important thing about China is he wants to recognize, obviously they had wars, but they didn't change anything is his view about it. Again, I really don't think we can make any claims for the historical accuracy of Hegel's views here one way or the other. That shouldn't be the way that we treat it. But what is really important and what I want to get at, and then we'll get the payoff in Germany, right, is Hegel thinks what's fascinating about Persia and Greece, and particularly about Greece, is that you get this interconnection of internal and external conflict. And that's what makes them historically productive and historically transformative. Right, in Persia, you get it between complete nations. In Greece, he emphasizes, I won't really have a chance to probably read this quote, but it's in the paper, that the Greeks fought with the Persians, the Greeks fought with themselves, some of the Greeks fought with the Persians against other Greeks, right? You had this combination of internal and external conflicts as Greeks who had different views about what it meant to be Greek. Some of them identified with what Persians thought was valuable about life and took that standpoint against each other, right? Okay, and that's what I say there, right? I said that. All right, so all of this to try and wrap it up before we get to the present is just to say that I think essentially we should see this as built into Hegel's account of the state that he's presenting in the philosophy of right. So in a way, I'm agreeing with Robert Pippin that it's built to fail, right? As I think Robert put it, something like staging its own dissolution, right? It's an essentially transitory period. And here I want to very much disagree with something that came out in the discussion of Anton's paper. I think in a way you'd almost be crazy to be Hegel and not think that war was essential for national formation, right? Everything that Hegel lived through, from the French Revolution to the development of Prussia, involved these internal German wars, but of course, both the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars involved foreign powers as well. So an essential interconnection of inner and outer conflict. So all of this sort of to back into door number 3, right? I want to open door number 3, as it were, the possibility of reform, by saying what I find so valuable about Hegel's state is the way it's essentially built for a transition period. And it really so much seems to us that we are in that kind of transition period. I am convinced that in some way we're still living through this split between a traditional corporate society and a future-oriented civil society and a kind of reformist state. And I realize that for a lot of people that seems archaic and so on. So I want to bring us into the present in the way only a historian of philosophy could do, by quoting something from 100 years ago. And this is what Max Weber says about estate and class. He says that they essentially coexist with each other in modern societies as forms of organization, and one or the other comes to the fore depending on the velocity with which history is moving. Right? So he says a relatively stable base for the acquisition and distribution of goods is needed for Stände, that is, a state stratification, to be favored. Destabilization by technical and economic change and upheaval, however, can threaten the Stand or state stratification by pushing the class situation into the foreground. My suggestion for what we can take for Hegel for our own current historical moment is in a way unwelcome and rather messy, right? Which is, I think we have to develop a kind of liberalism, if we're going to call it liberalism, or socialism, if we're going to call it socialism, that recognizes the enduring significance of status, of different kinds of social differentiation that are not really quite contractual, that have these very traditional forms. I mean, to some degree, maybe the most obvious way to see this in the United States is in terms of immigration status and the important role that that plays. But I think we've also had this extraordinary rebirth of the importance of the urban-rural divide in 2021. I mean, this seems spectacular to me and surprising. And then obviously educational status in the way that we've been talking about. And that I guess I'm putting Hegel in the same camp of people like Nancy Fraser and Wolfgang Streeck, who think the way forward is to engage actually with a kind of nationalism, right? Is to engage with something more positive in perhaps the kinds of images that Lydia is talking about. And that if we're not willing to engage in that, we leave all of that space open, right, for the demagogues. Again, I find the historical story that Hegel wants to tell, or this institutional design where he's trying to hold this all together, these people who want to launch us into the future, the people who want to stay rooted in the past, and the people who just, you know, want to get the classes scheduled for next semester. A kind of valuable model for doing that. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation that came in almost exactly on the 25-minute mark.
All right.
Well done.
Sorry it was so long.
No, that was great. You're right on time. So the first question, I see Terry's hand up, so I'm going to let him jump the queue. First question is
Fair enough.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. As usual, it was a great paper. I end up saying this about every one of your papers that you give here. Look, I think one of the interesting things that, in fact, one of the very most interesting things about it is the idea that Hegel is trying to grasp his own time and thought, but he's not just doing a snapshot of where his time is. He's got an idea of where it came from, why we're in the position we're in, but also a view of what future settlements might look like. You know, there are all these other settlements that are on the horizon out there and so on. And that one of the things, so several things are going on. One, he's got this kind of dynamic view of, you know, as you put it, of linking up the 5-year plan people with the tradition bound people and so on. But he's also very strongly really trying hard to foreclose certain types of settlements. And you see this in the treatment of gender. That is, at Hegel's time, Wollstonecraft is now being translated into almost every European language. Everybody's talking about it. He never mentions it. Holst in Germany has, you know, been made a splash and so on. And so there's Hegel, and also Fichte, by the way, too, right? Now coming in the middle, you know, coming out in their works, right, to argue against any form of female equality, or what we would regard as female equality. Now, Hegel himself thought he had given an argument for female equality. In his little marginalia to the philosophy of right, he writes, you know, the woman must be treated as an equal, right? The man is no better or no worse. They're both equals. But then he goes ahead and says everything else he says here. It's a kind of like a 1950s version of Leave It to Beaver family. You know? We're both equals, but on the other hand, you know, we know who's giving the orders around here.
Yeah.
So I'd like you just to kind of comment more on that about, you know, you might say the dynamic part of Hegel and the non-dynamic part of Hegel. That is, he very, very much is trying to foreclose certain kinds of settlements. This came up also, I think, with Stephen's paper about whether the corporations should try and be revived, or some version of it should try and be revived, and so on. And since you had so much to say about this, I'd be curious to hear if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a fascinating spot. And as I think you're quite right to say, there's, this isn't, you know, maybe ancient Greece on slavery, if you think that nobody was talking about slavery, right? Hegel is not in that position. There's lots of people talking about gender equality. It's also, I was talking with Andrea and I were emailing about this. It's the family that Hegel presents is a family that an extraordinarily small proportion of the German population of his time had any chance of realizing, right? Professors, pastors, bureaucrats, right? Certainly nobody in the agricultural sphere, right, was living in families where wives had no public role or no economic role. Right now, it's maybe the case, you could say, if you're trying to defend Hegel here, I don't know, that the agricultural division of labor is strongly gendered. It's just not, the gendering of it is not overlaid with the public-private distinction that Hegel, and Fichte even more so, very strongly lays over the top. Right? Quite the opposite, right? Women in farm families had very public roles and so on. So I mean, I definitely think it's one of these spots where I think you're right. He's trying to say here are what the future possibilities are. But it's, how should I put it? It's pure polemic. Right? I don't think there's any sense in which there is some sort of historical developmental aspect of it that Hegel can even in principle appeal to in terms of its justification, right? So I think it very much stands out. In maybe here's a contrast. Another way that another future option that he's very much trying to foreclose is an option in which the state essentially is what we would now call the night watchman state, right? That is simply concerned with protecting property rights and contracts and so on. There, he feels like he can say some things about Rome, right? He feels like he can say something about Rome. He feels like he can say something about England, right? I mean, this is something we were talking about before in Stephen's talk, in the role of the corporations, where you take the corporations out and you get that kind of poverty. But the embarrassment of Hegel on gender is instead he goes to nature, right? And the kind of natural differences. But I think in the absence, it's, I don't know, I shouldn't say anymore, but I think it's pure polemic on Hegel's view is what I would say. It's essentially disengaged from the rest of the argument in a really problematic way.
Later on, could you go and tell us a little bit more about what's in door number 3, and then I'll check off and go back over to the.
All right. Yeah, I've very little to say about what's in door number 3, except to say that I do think, well, here's what I'll say. It's connected to the strong institutionalism point. I think strong institutionalism is true. It's a terrifying truth in a way, and it's a truth that should convince us all to take great care of our institutions, because they really do form people in the way that people like Rousseau and Hegel have taught us that they do, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, sticking with our first 3 presenters, first 3 questions from presenters. Next up is Arash.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was an excellent paper. Thank you. So I especially like that you emphasized the role of conflict in history, because I mean, nowadays, I mean, like the recent trend in scholarship in Hegelian kind of emphasis on the concept of life, which is okay, but I mean, life is somehow at odds with conflict. I mean, one could say there are 2 types of conflict. One is manageable, as you say, manageable conflicts, and the other is unmanageable conflicts, there are deeper conflicts. Of course, the concept of life sits very easily with manageable conflict. It's the source of vitality, but like unmanageable conflict just kills the organism. So, and that is the type of conflict that is like operative in history for Hegel, and I think one should keep it. But my question is now about the relation between functional explanation and conflict, because I mean, in page 18, you have talked about it. You didn't talk about it in your presentation, but you said quite rightly and correctly that like functionalism is not Aristotelian, and it had one reason for that, because it incorporates a strong element of conflict in it. But I just, like at a deeper conceptual level, more technical level, I just have difficulty to understand how that works. Because on the one hand, we have functionalism where one explains antecedents by consequences, but where that consequences are fitted into a larger whole that, I mean, I think it's a kind of essential ingredient of functional explanation is that just there's a whole that is, relatively speaking, conflict-free.
Yeah.
So I just want to know, I mean, how can you manage both to have the concept of functionalism and life and conflict together? And thank you.
Yeah, temporarily, maybe, I guess. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Maybe here's the way I would put it, something like the following. And again, not thinking that Hegel is accurate about China or India, but just working with his contrast. He thinks in China, the thought was each family has this function in production and reproduction, and the whole model is paternal all the way up to the emperor, who is just father over everybody, right? In India, he thinks you have this caste system, which interestingly he denies is a race system, but he thinks it's a caste system where every group plays a distinctive functional role, right? But it's again a kind of a functional role in production primarily, I guess is what we sort of post-Marxists would say. I think what the Stände do for Hegel in his state is more like what the Greek city-states do. Their function is to express from a certain perspective what it means to be Greek. So Hegel's interpretation of the Peloponnesian War is that it's the Spartan expression of Greekness, which is about sacrifice for the community and conquest, against the Athenian expression of what Greekness means. And so that there's a function, if you like, right, of articulating that and bringing it into the conflict, right? And again, it is, I think, Hegel's view that war is an essential part of how that happens. The state is a way in which that can be made to some degree peaceful, right? At least, you know, you don't have armies and so on. But if there's a function, I think it's that. And I guess what I would say is what he says about Persia and Islam points to the following, which is, take the contrast with India. I think what Hegel thinks is, look, each caste in India is just trying to be what it is and trying to serve its function, and it has no aspirations to be the whole. But every Greek city-state wants to be the whole. And it wants to say, no, this is what being Greek means. In the same way that every Stand in Germany in 1820 claimed to speak for the whole, right? The Junker landowner class said, we're the real Prussia, right? And the merchants said, no, we're the real Germany of the future. And Stein and Hardenberg are saying, no, we're the ones making this stuff actually work, right? Here's how we're going to run it, right? So there's a claim to completeness in that kind of conflict that I think is beyond functionalism. I mean, it goes back to the logic, right? When Hegel presents the conceptual moments of individuality, particularity, and universality, as opposed to these objective moments, particularly of modality that we've just had at the end of the logic of essence. What he says is that they're all drawn together because they all claim to be the whole, and yet it's kind of transparent that they all require each other. And so in a way, they wear their inferential structure on their face in a way that the notion of substance doesn't. It's as if you could have the notion of substance without having the notion of an accident. But Hegel doesn't think you could have the notion of a universal without having a notion of the particular. So Hegel thinks he's trying to tell his contemporaries, look, we're going to need an agricultural sector. We're going to need a business sector. We're going to need bureaucracy and so on, right? Maybe I'll take this point to say another thing that behind door number 3, I guess, for Terry, which I almost said after Anton's paper, which is, I actually think people love the bureaucracy. And this is one of the weird things that Trump world has shown us, is that actually we love the CDC and we love Fauci. That, you know, all the English professors who teach Kafka are the same ones that want us to all write learning objectives on our syllabi and, you know, recertify our courses between curriculum committees and so on. Everybody likes bureaucracy. They just like their bureaucracy, the one that they can capture. This is a kind of feature of institutional life that I think is tremendously humorous. But yeah, anyway, that's
Thank you.
Thank you.